Well, greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome back to tonight's second half. Before we get into it, a couple links I'd like to share. As you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, and my merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. The links to Patreon and PayPal are in the description below, my merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters Volume 1, 2, and 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, the links to which are also in the description below. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support this channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe, click the like button, and please leave a comment. It really helps out. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's get on with today's second half, shall we? Today's first terrifying experience. This happened to me just over a decade and a half ago. Now I've gone back and forth a couple different times on whether or not to share this, partially because I know some won't believe it, and partially because I don't want to relive this in my head anymore. My uncle we'll call Bob. His daughter, my cousin, we'll call Sue. They used to live a good distance out in the woods. I'm not going to say what state, but suffice to say, it's a very rural area in southeastern United States. The closest main road was a couple of miles away, and it was one gravel road onto another to get to their house. The only house within walking distance, a long walk at that, about an eighth of a mile, was a second uncle of mine, John, and the two of them had lived in that house in the middle of those woods all of their lives up until Bob decided to buy a mobile home and set it up a little further into the woods. Yeah, it probably sounds nutso to want to live in the middle of the no friggin' nowhere. The town's TV cable service didn't even offer service to his house, and you could barely get cell signal half the time, but my uncle loved it. He was an outdoorsy type, and honestly a bit of a gun nut. He fancied himself a cowboy, I guess, always wearing a cowboy hat and watching old gunslinger TV shows on VHS. Like I said, no cable. My cousin Sue never knew anything different, so she liked living out in the woods just fine as well, up until they moved into the trailer, but more on that later. So, being a younger boy, I thought my Uncle Bob was the coolest guy in the world. I always enjoyed shooting and plinking as a kid. My parents bought me a .22 and taught me how to use it and how to safely handle firearms very young. So of course I loved visiting Uncle Bob out in the woods and going hunting with him and checking out his cool guns. That is until both my parents got switched to the second shift of their job, and I had to start going to Bob's house after school every day. At first it wasn't so bad. The lack of cable really bummed me out, but we had VHSs. But what really started to get to me was the walk back to my parents' car at 11:30 when they got off and came to pick me up. The gravel road that led from my Uncle John's house to Bob's was barely passable as a road, and lit by a single streetlight. My parents, convinced that a 12-year-old boy had nothing to worry about walking down a gravel road at midnight in the middle of nowhere, I mean, who's going to bother me, right? Would usually park at John's house and call down for Bob to send me walking down the road. It honestly wasn't that big of a deal. Bob would stand at his door and watch me walk up the road to make sure I was all right, and I'd no sooner be out of his sight than in the high beams of my parents' car, and they'd be greeting me back to safety. But it sure felt like a walk through hell. Other than the TV situation and the long, dark walk, Bob, Sue, and I would sit around and talk about hunting or watching videotaped hunting shows. Bob loved hunting. Hunted every single day. Both of my uncles had been hunting those woods since they were little and knew damn near everything about the area. Bob had some pretty cool spooky stories he would tell us from his hunting experiences. Mostly just weird sounds in the woods, occasionally seeing some weird things once or twice. It always tripped me out when he would tell Sue and me those stories about the woods around the trailer we were sitting in at that very moment. Of course, John would never back Bob up on those stories. If you asked him about any of them, or if he had ever seen anything, he'd just say something kind of dodgy about how you can't explain everything, and just because he didn't know what something was, didn't mean it was anything weird. I don't remember a single time John confirmed anything Bob had told me, at least not with any kind of conviction, but that's probably partially because Bob was a natural-born storyteller. He could make a scary story up off the top of his head that would give Stephen King nightmares. That was something else we did to pass time. We sat around and listened to horror stories that my uncle would come up with. Now, don't get me wrong, he never mixed up his real life "this happened to me" eerie type stories with his obviously made-up supernatural type stories, but knowing how John kind of shrugged Bob's true stories off, and knowing how good of a storyteller Bob was, I always took his tales with a shaker of salt. So anyway, like I said, I really liked hanging out at Uncle Bob and Cousin Sue's, and going hunting with Bob, and everything was pretty normal at their trailer for a good while after they moved in. They had even gotten an indoor dog that I loved to death and loved to play with, named Muffin. I had maybe been staying with them after school for probably a month when all of it went to crap. When it first started, I really kind of wondered if they were playing a joke on me or setting up some tall tale of a story. It never seemed to happen when I was there. Only on the weekends or after midnight when I had gone home. Someone was trying to screw with Sue's head. Bob would be gone during the day hunting or down at town, and someone would mess with their trailer, knocking on the doors, knocking on walls, throwing sticks and rocks at it. Now, Sue was no Southern belle. She knew her way around a 12-gauge pump shotgun better than most people. But one can only sit in a trailer in the middle of the woods alone and listen to the windows in the other rooms get knocked on before you start to wonder who the heck is coming all the way out into a rural bum-F Egypt to mess with you. Not to mention the stuff happening at 2 or 3 in the morning. Sue and Bob had bedrooms on the opposite end of the trailers, and at either end, looking outside their window, was a clearing, maybe 40 to 50 feet wide, and then a tree line. At night, in the early hours of the morning, Sue would hear someone walking rather heavily around the wood line and occasionally screaming in a high-pitched scream. My dad and my Uncle John suggested it was a panther and not to worry about it, but Sue took to sleeping with the 12-gauge next to her bed anyway. Like I said, I honestly didn't believe it at first. I could barely muster the courage to walk from one end of the gravel road to the other at night, with a full-grown man with a gun watching over me. Who the F would have the balls to be wandering in the woods at 3 a.m., screwing with an obviously armed woman? And the fact that it only happened when I wasn't there seemed a little too convenient. I would have thought maybe they were setting me up for some kind of grand story, or even that Sue, she was a bit of a drama queen, was making it up for attention, except that they were kind of keep hush-hush, at least from me. The little bits of info I got were from mostly hearing other room conversations between Sue and Bob, or Bob and John. I had to piece together what was going on, and question Sue about it later. At first, she just kind of said it was nothing for me to worry about and everything was fine. That is, until one day after school. I got to their house and Bob and Sue were waiting for me at John's house to walk me down to theirs. This was unusual. It was a perfectly bright and sunny day, no murderers, rapists, or home intruders in sight. But there was something really strange in the air that day. Some weird glances between Bob and Sue. Something had them on edge. If the awkward looks and edgy acting hadn't tipped me off, The firepower should have. Bob had a 6-shooter strapped to his leg and a 30-30 lever action in his hand, and Sue had her shotgun by her side. It wasn't until Bob was making dinner in the kitchen later that I found out why. Someone had tried to break in on Sue that day. Bob had gotten up in the morning and went squirrel hunting, and someone tried to rip the door off their trailer. Bob hadn't gone out for a few days given the strange occurrences of the past few days, but everything had seemed to die down. So this day he had decided to go out just for a little while, sticking close to the trailer, and see how things went. No more than 45 minutes after he had left, Sue had been sitting on the couch and heard the handle of the door, which she had triple locked, start to rustle back and forth. Gently at first, and then harder, and then finally a full-fledged attempt to pull the door off the hinges. Sue had somehow composed herself long enough to call Bob's cell phone and scream for help before grabbing the shotgun and falling into a crying mess on the floor, waiting on God knows what was coming through that door after her. It had been watching and waiting on Bob to leave. It gave up a few minutes before Bob got back, either detoured by the door lock, Sue's dog Muffin attacking the inside of the door trying to get out, or at the sound of the shotgun's pump action racking around in the chamber. I hadn't noticed walking in. I seem to remember one of them opening the door for me, but later that day I checked the doorknob, and it was decimated. I'm not sure how it was even hanging on, much less working, and I could tell this wasn't usual Sue drama when she had told it to me. She was nearly in tears. Muffin would not leave her side the entire night, no matter how much I tried to play with her. She had the look in her eye of someone who had been through an emotional hell of a day. After dinner, just after sundown, we tried to regain some sense of normalcy. We played a few games of Sorry, a few games of cards, and were sitting down to listen to Bob continue one of his stories, the Great Smoky Mountain Massacre. Sue and I had sat on the couch with Muffin lying between us. Bob sat in his chair perpendicular to us. I was honestly not in the mood to hear a scary story from Bob, the master of terror himself, after hearing what had went down that day. But Sue wanted to, so I was okay with it. I suppose maybe looking back, she wanted to put the fear back into something that couldn't really hurt her. Who knows what was outside that door, but at least in there right then, no story was breaking her door down to get at her. 5 minutes in, Bob had us enthralled as usual, and I was just leaning my head back to take a sip of soda when, bam! Something hit the metal trailer wall directly behind my head so hard I fell. Out of my seat, literally, I jumped into the floor, hit the deck, took cover. Sue in the floor beside me, Muffin barking at the top of her lungs, Bob grabbing a rifle and a spotlight, slamming the back door open and flying out of it, trying to kick Muffin back inside. I could hear very heavy footsteps hitting the ground to the tree line just behind the house. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then an eternity. I remember it like it was yesterday. Finally, what seemed like hours later, it was probably 15 minutes at most, I heard Bob yell to Sue that he was coming back in, which was a good thing, as Sue by now had a firearm in hand. He walked back in with disbelief in his eyes. He hadn't made it around the house in time to see what had hit the wall, but the area where the bang was heard, the area just behind my head, was about 10 feet off the ground. There was a dent in the metal the size of an abnormally large man's fist, no more than a foot behind where my head had just been only minutes ago. And my Uncle Bob, who until that point in his life had been the great white hunter to me, had no explanation. Bob and Sue walked me to my parents' car that night. Of course, my parents, being rational human beings and knowing Bob's storytelling and Sue's flair for the dramatic, didn't believe it was anything other than perhaps a peeping Tom or some backwards neighbor who had no fear of death via acute lead poisoning. and nothing to do but walk several miles in the middle of the night and bang on a trailer and run, trying to scare us. It didn't matter if they believed me, though. Just as quickly as the terrorizing had started, it stopped. A month or so passed, and there was no more incidents to speak of, or at least nothing that couldn't be blamed on an overactive imagination or jumpy nerves. No more taps, no more muffin barking fits, no more replaced doorknobs. Still, the occurrence made Bob decide that maybe they should cut back a few trees and extend the wood line away from their house a bit, if for nothing else than to extend the sight lines just in case. So they hired a couple of guys to come in during the days with chainsaws and cut some of the trees around the edge of the clearing. They were friends of the family, so they worked slowly, but it gave Bob some time to get some hunting in, trusting that no sane or even insane individual would try breaking in on Sue midday while guys with chainsaws running full blast were walking around. And he was right. No weird activity at all to speak of, until one Sunday night, a few weekends later. I wasn't there for this part, but it is what I am able to recall piecing together the next day from my 12-year-old mind. Now, over a decade and a half later, Muffin, being an indoor dog and needing to go outside as indoor dogs often do, was sitting next to the front door with her leash sometime just after dark. Bob, not having me to send out to walk her, still a bit anxious from the strange happenings a month before, grabbed his rifle, flashlight, put Muffin on her leash, and plunged out into the warm, dark night. Sue was inside washing dishes from dinner and looking out into the yard, or the newly cleared area, and was just able to faintly see Bob and Muffin from a little bit of the glow the gravel road streetlight provided. Almost no sooner than her paws had hit the dirt, Muffin flipped crap. She was a small dog, maybe 20 pounds, but she was hitting above her weight, barking and pulling Bob toward the tree line with everything she had. Bob was no small man by any means, but trying to balance a flashlight in one hand, a dog with a leash tied around it, and a rifle in the other, I guess it's fair to say that Muffin was winning the fight. After getting Muffin to stop yanking his arm out of socket, Bob tried to shine his flashlight at the tree line to see what Muffin was barking at. But the beam wouldn't quite reach. All he could see at that direction was what looked like a very thick tree stump the yard clearing had left, and then the tree stump stood up. Sue, inside at the kitchen window and being a lot closer than Bob to the end of the house/yard the former tree stump was now standing at, said the figure was tall, very bulky. Tall meaning over 8 feet in height, and bulky as in as wide around as a large tree stump. The massive figure took a step toward Bob just at the first before the first shot rang out, and then the second and the third, and so on. The hulking shade, possibly startled by the noise of the 30-30 Winchester, or possibly hit with a round or several, turned and retreated back into the woods. At first, Bob and the fearless Muffin started toward the woods to give chase and find out just what in the hell that tree stump had morphed into. However, after a few steps, and realizing he had no idea how many rounds he had left in his rifle, Bob thought better of chasing an obviously physical superior, possibly wounded, animal into the deep dark woods in a pitch black of night, regardless of how much courage Muffin possessed. Instead, after a quick reload, the night was spent at Uncle John's house. The next day, John and Bob went to look at the scene of the carnage. Brush and small trees were knocked down for yards leading deeper into the woods, back over a creek and toward a bluff. But the trail went cold. There was no obvious signs of blood. So, just what was terrorizing my uncle and my cousin? I have no idea. I do know I talked to John about it a little bit over a year later, after my uncle and cousin had moved out of that house and into a more populated, less rural part of town. I asked John what he thought it was, and if he thought the story was just Bob embellishing for the sake of a good tale, or Sue playing everything up for attention. John's usual casual disregard for Bob's stories wasn't there this time. He just said he didn't know, and he didn't think he ever would. John actually moved into the trailer after Bob and Sue moved out. Never had any problems as far as I know. Not a peep. You may be wondering what finally made my uncle and my cousin move out between the tree stump night and the time I talked to my Uncle John about everything. What was it that finally made someone who had lived within an eighth of a mile radius from their childhood home their whole life, and who loved living in the middle of nowhere, finally pack up and move to a less rural area across town? Well, unfortunately for me, that's where I come in. It had been probably 6 or 7 months since my Uncle Bob had shot at some towering behemoth of an unidentifiable humanish-shaped animal. They had speculated just what the shape in the darkness had been for months. Maybe it was a really, really large human. Maybe it was a bear. Black bears are pretty common around there. And one standing on its hind legs for a minute would appear like a stump getting huge, especially in a panic of the moment. Nobody knew. It really didn't matter, though. Either Bob had hit it with enough lead to poison a fishing village, or it had decided it wasn't fond of getting shot at. Either way, it hadn't been back to bother my cousin or my uncle. Bob almost never left the first 2 months, especially without Sue. In the 3rd month, he started cautiously going out, but staying close, and as things tend to do, they started to go back to normal. Finally, after over a half a year, Bob was going out almost every day hunting again. Summer had come and gone, and I had decided to spend a Saturday hunting with my uncle. Sue seemed perfectly fine staying alone again. I think she was sick of Bob being there all the time, so Bob and I decided to make a go of it and get some squirrels. My parents had just gotten me my first shotgun, a single-shot break-action 20-gauge. We walked for maybe a mile and a half, which takes a little while when you are trying to be quiet in the woods, and we were just crossing a fence onto the neighbor's property. My uncle was friends with the owner and had permission to cross the property as a shortcut. When my uncle's cell phone rang, which in of itself was a miracle given the cell phone coverage of the day and how far we were in the woods. He quickly silenced it and handed my gun over the fence to me. I had crossed first. We had to climb over it as it was a tall fence. Just as he was about to hand his gun over, the phone began to ring again. Bob pulled the phone out of his pocket and looked at it, answered, and was about to say, "Sue, I can't talk right now," when I could hear it over his speaker. Loud banging on metal. Bang, bang, bang. Muffin barking her head off. Sue screaming for help. Grabbing his gun and slamming his phone into his pocket, Bob took off running in the direction of their house, leaving me on the wrong side of the fence. Bob yelled, "I'll be back. Stay here." At this point, I believe I was 12 or 13. The exact details kind of a blur with the time. But the event, I can still close my eyes and relive if I'm not careful. Bob running as fast as he can through the woods, rifle in hand, his brown jacket getting smaller and smaller in the distance until I'm alone. I'm alone in the woods, not old enough to even drive, barely a teenager, not even in high school yet. I'm alone in the woods, no one around for miles, with a single-shot shotgun and a pocket full of shells as my uncle speeds off to defend my cousin from God only knows what kind of monster my imagination was coming up with. I had never even seen the silhouette of what they had seen that night. Only heard the description and the sound of the banging coming from behind my head that night, 10 feet off the ground. I was alone in the woods, and Muffin, all 20 pounds of her, was trying every bit as hard to get out and tear the monster's throat out to protect my cousin. But I was here, almost defenseless. I was alone in the woods, and I was scared to death. Put your 12-year-old self there. Put your 12-year-old self in the woods alone, with a monster and the demons and every creature from under your bed and stuck in your imagination. Up until that moment, I had never been scared of the woods, but right then and there, I just wanted to get out. At first, I was able to stay pretty calm and collected. I carefully unloaded the single round in my shotgun after taking a good 5 minutes glare around the area to make sure I wouldn't need the single round immediately. Slid the gun under the fence, climbed over the fence myself, and then reloaded it. I wanted to get out of there really badly. I knew roughly the way back, but honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back to my uncle's house given the current situation. I figured I'd follow the trail most of the way to his house, then veer off to the left to make my way to my Uncle John's. It would be at least a moderate safe place to go. At least a lot safer than waiting around here for Bob to scare off whatever was trying to break in on Sue. Just for it to come out here and find me wandering around. At least she had a house, a dog, and an arsenal of Bob's firearms to protect her. Hell, I only had one round at a time. So, weighing the risk of getting in trouble or not staying put like Bob told me versus the risk of getting eaten by a monster, I started down the trail back to John's house. At best, I'd run into Bob coming back for me. At worst, I'd get to John's and call Bob's cell phone and let him know where I was. And at the very worst, I'd run headlong into this monster and have to fight for my life with what would be the equivalent of a BB gun to it. At first, the walk was almost peaceful, birds chirping, squirrels running about. They always knew when you weren't going to shoot them for some reason, and that's when they run out in front of you. I say walk because it started out kind of as a brisk speed walk, sort of, as fast as I could without crashing through the brush and announcing my presence to whatever was within earshot. But then something changed. There was no more bird sounds, no little animal noises, just a steady, heavy crunching of foliage underfoot. And it was not by me. Something coming toward me, and that was just out of sight. It couldn't be Bob. It was coming from the direction I'm coming from, but behind me, walking with me toward Bob's house. Oh, crap, I'm out of here. I remember thinking under my breath as I broke into whatever I could manage for a sprint in the heavier underbrush. A minute into my sprint, I started thinking I was silly. There's no way anything's behind me. After all, isn't this whole thing just Bob and Sue's imagination anyway? Their imagination now chasing me through the woods, and I'm still hearing it follow me? Something is still crunching away as fast as I am, keeping pace with me in these godforsaken woods. By the time I hit the clearing to John's yard, I don't know if whatever it was still keeping pace with me or catching up or completely gone. For all I knew, it was my imagination. The second I hit the clearing, its giant arm was going to grab me and snatch me back into the bleakness of the forest forever. Propelled by that thought and gaining traction in the clearing, I didn't stop running until I was pounding on my uncle's door with everything I had. When he finally got me inside and calmed me down, he explained that whatever had been breaking in on Sue was gone when he and Bob got there. Sue had called John as well, and that Bob had just went back into the woods a few minutes ago to find me, meaning there was no way it could have been my Uncle Bob following me. John called Bob to let him know I was safe and sound, and a few long months after that day, as soon as they could afford to get out, Sue and Bob moved away from that trailer in the middle of the woods. As far as I know, after that day, they never had any more problems. However, on their last day there, Bob told me he joked to Sue he was going to leave a forwarding address on the door so the visitor would know where to find her. Somehow, the humor of all that one was lost. Wow. Imagine being that 12 to 13-year-old little boy. You know, with all the tall tales that were told by his uncle, and then his cousin being a drama queen, as he had stated, um, you know, fear does come when false stories are told. Um, if you have children, you know what I'm talking about. You know, my daughter will watch something scary or talk to her friend and get freaked out, and all the lights are on in the house. And, after that, it eventually dissipates because there's no more talk of anything like that after. But this poor boy has to hear what's going on nightly and then see some of the damage, to ask his other uncle, hey, what's going on at Uncle Bob's? And him to say, I'm not sure, I don't think he's making this up though, is, it's enough to put you on edge. And then it's all over. You hear about this shootout, the siege, the battle. Uncle Bob won. And you're out hunting a couple months later, and bam, it all happens again. And you're stuck out in the woods alone, petrified of your shadow at that point. Because at that point, reality set in. Reality really set in. Because at that point, you are now thinking that this animal, this monster, this creature is now stalking you, and you can hear it for real. It's not just in your imagination. But with the reality and your imagination, it's all far worse. And then your family moves out of a place that they've lived forever. A place that your uncle has lived in his entire life, loved, cherished, and moved into an area where you'd never see or ever feel you'd see your uncle at. And there he is, playing a hillbilly Martha Stewart. That's the real deal, my friends. That's the real deal. Anyway, I hope everything is well with everybody, and I want to thank you all for all of your support. It truly, truly means the world to me.